Good morning. Thanks for attending these sessions about innovations for monitoring patients on regular wards. So it's not in the ICU, it's on regular wards. So the goal will be to prevent ICU admission or actually to monitor more closely our patients as soon as they leave the ICU. So first of all, I'd like to disclose the fact I'm today leading a consulting organization based in Switzerland where we focus on digital innovations with medical applications, and we don't sell any medical device. So why should we monitor patients differently on the general ward? If I take the example of surgical patients, as you know, many patients go to the hospital for surgery and have to stay for complications. We know, for instance, from the large international outcome study that around 17% of patients are going to develop at least one postoperative complication. It's 27% after a major surgery. So many patients undergoing every surgery develop postoperative complications. And we know these complications may be detected with a delay, mainly because nurses are spot checking vital signs only from time to time, every 4 to 6 hours typically. So now we're able to monitor vital signs continuously. We can first quantify how much we miss with intermittent spot check. And this is a very interesting study coming from the Cleveland Clinic, showing that when nurses were spot checking SpO2 every 4 hours, they were actually missing 82% of hypoxemic events. And when they were monitoring blood pressure or measuring blood pressure with a Waka test every 4 hours, they were missing 79% of hypotensive events. Oral opioids may induce respiratory depression, and there is today a consensus to say that no patient should be harmed by opioid-induced respiratory depression because it's 100% preventable. And here I will just quote this editorial from Dan Kessler, who wrote that it is likely that many catastrophic respiratory events could be prevented if we were monitoring continuously vital signs, in particular respiratory variables such as respiratory rate and SpO2. The nurse-to-patient ratio is often suboptimal on the ward. We all know that. And I like very much this systematic review published in Surgery a few years ago, showing a relationship, an inverse relationship between failure to rescue, that is to say death related to postoperative complication, and the nurse staffing level. So here we have obviously two options. We can either dramatically increase the number of nurses working on the ward, but we all know it's not going to happen tomorrow, or we can try to upgrade the way we monitor our patients. In-hospital cardiac arrest often occur on regular wards. As an intensivist, I tended to believe that most arrests were occurring in very acute settings like the ICU, the cath lab, the emergency department. As a matter of fact, if you look at the results of this large audit study done by the group of Jerry Nolan years ago in the UK, you see a large number of in-hospital cardiac arrests, over 23,000. As a matter of fact, most of these arrests occur on regular wards, where patients again are monitored only intermittently. There's obviously a trend towards the admission of older patients with multiple comorbidities who are obviously at higher risk of clinical deterioration. And clearly overwhelmed ICUs cannot cope with the surge of acutely ill patients. It became obvious during the pandemic. And that's why with Benoît Vallée from France and Bernd Sobel from Germany, we propose not only to increase the number of ICU beds, but also to upgrade, improve the way we monitor patients on regular wards. And the last letter of the mnemonic, or the last reason to consider to rethink the way we monitor patients on the ward is because remote and wireless monitoring techniques are now available. So this is an example of the solution provided by GE. You see a patient wearing electrodes, abdominal and chest electrodes for continuous monitoring of respiratory rate. and a finger sensor for continuous monitoring of SpO2 and pulse rate. The patient is also wearing a smartphone-like device, which is actually a gateway, receiving the information from the sensors and sending it to the Wi-Fi of the hospital and to a central station. So one of the key questions is which variables should we monitor more closely? So to answer that question, we have actually data from the literature. This study is very interesting. It's a very large study, over 400,000 patients. And in this study, they looked at triggers for rapid response team activation. And you can see that most of the time, rapid response team activations are triggered by a rise in heart rate, a drop in SpO2, a rise in respiratory rate, more often than a drop in respiratory rate. That's something we need to keep in mind. And a drop in blood pressure, meaning that these four vital signs actually are almost equally interesting for monitoring on the ward. Another way to answer the question is to look at these kind of studies using machine learning algorithms to predict severe adverse events, for instance, cardiac arrest, I2 transfer, and death, once again in a regular ward. In this study, what's interesting is that they rank vital signs according to the weight they are in the predictive algorithm. You know, what was the respective predictive value of each of every single vital sign, and you think that respiratory rate was actually the most informative variable. And it's not really a surprise, you know, as a clinician, you know that respiratory rate may decrease, of course, in patients receiving opioids, but may also increase in patients developing respiratory complications, and more than that, in sepsis, in patients developing metabolic acidosis, in patients with shock, and so on and so forth. So it's not a surprise to confirm actually that respiratory rate is a very sensitive marker of clinical deterioration. The problem we have is that today we all know that respiratory rate is not properly monitored. Sometimes it's not even measured by nurses on the ward. And that's why the good news is that there are more and more techniques becoming available to monitor automatically and more accurately respiratory rate on a regular ward. I think it's important to bear in mind that all techniques were not created equal. Here is the example of an adhesive patch designed to monitor respiratory rate from ECG variability and accelerometer data. And here you have a validation study. So you see on the x-axis, you have the reference respiratory rate. On the y-axis, you have the respiratory rate measured by these adhesive patch. And you see a pretty wide dispersion with only 77% of the measurements part of the safe zones, the zones A and B of the Clarke grid. Here you have the solution developed by GE. Respiratory rate is measured using or detecting changes in impedance thermography. And here you see a validation study with, again, the reference respiratory rate on the x-axis and respiratory rate measured by the wearable on the y-axis. And you see that in that case, with that tool, it was over 99% of the measurements were actually in the safe zone A and B of the Clarke grid. So what's the reason for this performance? It's probably because actually there are at least two channels which are analyzed at the same time. And so if for any reason, like in this example, I mean, you don't get the information from one channel, very likely you will get it from the other. So clearly it's time to reconsider the way we monitor our patient on the ward. But one of the key questions is to know if it has a real impact or not on patient safety. So to answer that question, it's important to remember what's the main value proposition. The idea is not to prevent complications. I mean, complications are going to happen. But it's to detect complication at a very early stage. And then to prevent severe adverse events, for example, the complication that would need ICU admission or that would lead to cardiac arrest. It's to give the opportunity to physicians, nurses working on the ward to detect this complication at a very early stage and then prevent, if not all, at least most or some severe adverse events. As a matter of fact, there are already studies showing that when we monitor vital signs continuously on the ward, it is actually associated with a better outcome. Here you see large studies with over 1,000 patients per study. These are before-after comparison studies. Okay, the investigators started to implement continuous monitoring on the ward and then compare the outcome variables before and after the implementation. And you can see that they were able to report some outcome benefits, typically a decrease in rescue events, a decrease in ICU admission, a decrease in cardiac arrest. There is even a study from Sube reporting a decrease in mortality. So I recently updated this paper for another publication. You see today, I think we can claim that at least 10 large studies, including over 170,000 patients, are reporting outcome benefit when using continuous monitoring. And the good news is that 7 out of these 10 studies were done with wireless wearable systems. The very last one is actually not a before-after study. It's a propensity match comparison study done by the team of ESICM, and comparing, as you can see, the outcome of over 12,000 patients who were monitored, I would say, the old way. Nurses were checking vital signs from time to time, and to almost 8,000 patients who were monitored continuously. So, of course, the matching is to ensure the patients are comparable. And then you see that in that study, actually, we observed a significant decrease in the composite outcome of combining ICU admission and mortality. So far I mentioned opportunities to improve patient safety. There are obviously a few challenges associated with the implementation of these new monitoring systems. To better understand these challenges, we did a survey a couple of years ago among the anesthesia community. We got a feedback from over 1,000 anesthesiologists from Western Europe and from the US. And to the question where the main implementation challenges, as you can see, the number one was the economic challenge. So it's very important to keep in mind that if we effectively decrease ICU admission, hospital length of stay, severe adverse events, it should be associated with economic benefit as well. And this is an economic model developed in the US, showing that based on the outcome studies I showed you previously, one of the studies part of the table, actually the average US hospital should be able to save between $3 and $7 million a year if implementing continuous monitoring on a regular ward. That's a real life study. It's not a modelization anymore. It's a small medical surgical ward in the US, but they started to implement continuous monitoring with wireless system. And then they observe actually savings ranging between $200 and $700 per patient who is in hospital break even after 6 to 9 months. So I think it's important to bear in mind that it's not only clinical value, it should be associated as well with economic benefit. The second challenge, at least for the anesthesiologists who were part of the survey, is connectivity, IT. And we all experience disruptions when using Bluetooth devices. And this is an example of a study I find very interesting. So on the x-axis, you have the number of days. And on the y-axis, you have 22 patients who were monitored with a wireless monitoring system using Bluetooth connectivity. And so in red, it's when actually the signal was lost. And in green, it's when the signal was correctly monitored. And you see that for some patients, obviously it was working pretty well. For other patients, it was kind of a nightmare. And it was almost impossible to monitor properly or at least continuously patients using Bluetooth connectivity. So I think it may not be a big issue if you have in mind home monitoring, because by definition, if you can discharge the patient from the hospital, they are not super high risk. Okay, otherwise you would probably ask them to stay in the hospital. And so then it will be not real continuous monitoring from home, but more track and spot check you will get anyway from this kind of system. But if you have in mind patients who keep in the hospital, I think we want systems we can rely on, able to provide continuous information 100% of the time. And that's why I think it's very important to have medical grade connectivity protocols. And that's one of the features, developed by GE for this continuous monitoring system. The clear challenges, nurse pushback. When you start discussing with nurses working on the work about continuous monitoring, of course, they have in mind existing continuous monitoring products, beeping all the time. So it's important to realize these new systems have been specifically designed to be used on regular wards with smart algorithm on board to filter artifacts and to prevent false alarms. Last one, I like very much. When we ask anesthesiologists where alarms should be heard or seen, only 12% thought that it should be heard in the patient room. And I like this feedback because I personally believe that we should not forget alarms have not been designed to disturb patients, to increase their level of anxiety. They have been designed to inform clinicians. I think it's important to have monitoring systems able to keep silent in the patient room and send the information through a central station or directly to the pager or the smartphone of the nurse. So to conclude, hope like me, a great time to rethink the way we monitor a patient on a regular ward. Clinical deterioration may be overlooked for hours, quite easy to suspect, but we have now evidence coming from continuous monitoring techniques. Finding patients before they crash is possibly the next major opportunity to improve patient safety. Wireless solutions now exist for the automatic, continuous, and mobile monitoring of vital signs. They may have to improve patient safety and satisfaction, but also to decrease ICU admission and related costs, and that's something important to bear in mind. So, to finish, I want to share with you my wish list. If you consider implementing continuous monitoring on your work, on general work, I think what you need is a mobile solution. Because think about surgical patients. Early mobilization is one of the key elements of enhanced recovery programs. So we want patients to be able to leave their bed, even to leave their room for physiotherapy, for example. Meaning you won't be able to use capnography or bed sensors or video monitoring. I know there are more and more publications on these sensors, particularly video monitoring. At first sight, it looks pretty interesting, but it won't be possible to monitor patients once again as soon as they move. The monitoring solution you are going to select has to be comfortable to wear, otherwise patients would never accept it. It has to be easy to use, otherwise nurses would never accept it. It's good if you have a medical grade connectivity protocol, once again, to avoid disruptions and to really trust that your system is able to detect clinical deterioration as soon as it will occur. Silent mode in the room, I think, is not a luxury. That's something we need to offer to patients to preserve, for example, a quality of sleep and to avoid disturbing patients. We know actually it's going to speed up the recovery process. And last but not least, data must be shared with electronic medical record system so that early warning scores or even more sophisticated scores can be calculated by the computers. With that, I thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.